touch it, it's off. Touch it, it's back on. Touch it, it's off. Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In this one we're going to be just basically trying to help people that are new to soldering. I get a lot of requests all the time about, hey, like, can you make a video about soldering? I know there are plenty of videos out there on YouTube about soldering, but maybe I can offer you guys some assistance that might just help with drone building in general and just overall expertise in soldering. I've been doing this stuff for about 20 years now. I started when I was 11 years old. My father does this as a in his career literally every single day, so it's been something that I've been around my entire life. And I'll just go ahead and tell you right now that as I am an advocate for quality gear with drones, I am also an advocate for quality gear with soldering. So if you can afford it, then buy the best quality soldering iron you can. I'll show you what I use. You're not going to break the bank using what I use, because this, this kit right here is about $100. These are, $70, and it's something that you're going to use almost every single time that you build anything, especially drone related. You're going to use it every single time. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. I'll talk about the gear that I use, and then we'll get into some actual video of me soldering, and you can see the techniques that I'm using to get the types of, the flow that I want, and then also the joint that I end up with and how clean it is. So first of all, the iron itself, I use two different irons. One of them is this Hakko FX888D, which is about a $100 kit, plugs into the wall, uses 110 volts, comes with everything you see here. You got a nice soldering iron you can change tips on. You have this little station right here which has a sponge down here which you wet, and this is to wipe the soldering iron tip off, and also some steel wool in there to clean the tip. So again, this is really nice to have at home because you do have something where you can put the soldering iron down when you're not using it, where in your next option you won't have that feature, but it is a lot more compact. The next option is this TS100, which is a soldering iron that runs on DC power. You can plug in anything from 2 to 6S batteries, so typically any of your drone batteries you can plug into this thing, and then that heats up, and it'll heat up to, I think, 350 degrees Celsius, which is really, really good. It's variable temperature, has a little LCD screen. You can adjust whatever you want. It's very programmable, but I just leave mine at 300 degrees C, and I keep it in my field toolkit. I just open this guy up, put this guy in here, and if I need to do a field repair, then I have it with me. And I keep this one at home, and it's very durable. I've had it left on for like 3 days before and come back, and the tip is fine. It's a little crunchy. I just scraped it off with a soldering iron, and with a razor blade, and we're good to go. So those are the irons that I use, and I typically operate at about 800 to 850 degrees Fahrenheit. I know that sounds really hot, but I'm very fast with my soldering, and I don't hold the iron on the boards or whatever wires that I'm using, and I need it to get hot very quickly. So, I keep my irons pretty hot, and I'll talk about that stuff later when we watch actual video of me soldering. So next, we're going to talk about the next most important part, which is the type of solder that you're using. You don't want to use leaded solder, so stay away from, you don't want to use lead-free solder. Scratch what I said at the beginning. You don't want to use lead-free solder. You do want to use leaded solder. Ideally, you want to have a 60-40 split, which is 60% tin and 40% lead. It is perfectly acceptable to use the 63-37 split, which is actually what this is. This is a Kester brand. It's actually 0.8 diameter, or 0.8 millimeter diameter thickness, and then you can get up to 1 millimeter. You can get really thick if you want. You can go to 2 millimeters, but ideally I think anywhere between 0.8 millimeter and 1 millimeter diameter for drone stuff is ideal. So Kester, I'll put a link to the description and all of this stuff below. But again, this is the stuff that I'm using, and again, it is lead solder, so it does have lead in it. Try not to breathe the fumes, even though it's very difficult because it always goes towards your face. Next, the things that you can use that you don't necessarily have to use, and I'll just go in order of necessity. So first of all, I use a 2x4 or any kind of wood block to solder on, because obviously this stuff's going to get hot, and if you're soldering on carpet like this, which is just a build mat off of Amazon, this is literally a doormat that I use to build on, keeps my tools and stuff from scratching my glass table, which I know isn't the perfect build surface, but anyways, I've always used these mats. I got the idea from my father, and it's just passing it down to the next generation maybe one day. So yeah, anyways, get some wood It's non-conductive and it doesn't necessarily absorb a lot of heat, so it's really nice to solder on. Next, you'll probably want a good pair of wire strippers and a good pair of needle nose pliers. The way you want the wire strippers is so that you can strip wire, you can strip off the actual insulation on the wire so that you can get to the center or the core so that you can solder to it. So a good pair of wire strippers is literally going to cost you like anywhere from $8 to $15. Again, link in the description. I don't have any affiliation with any of these companies. I'm just showing you what I have, and it's literally just going on Amazon. Oh, that looks good, order it. The Hakko was recommended by my father, but again, $100 for something that's as quality as it is a really good deal. So again, nice pair of needle nose pliers, and why you would need those is to hold wires when you need to put them in a place and solder them so that you're not, like, your big dopey hands aren't in the way. So I have big dopey hands anyways. So need a nice pair of needle nose pliers. Next, you're gonna want some wick, which is literally just copper braided material, and this stuff is used to get solder off of things if you were to drop it in a place you don't want it, or you necessarily want to get a new put some new solder on something and you want to get as much of the old off as you can, or you want to swap from leaded or lead-free solder to leaded solder or something. This is going to get it off, and I'll show you how this works later. Last thing you might need is a pair or an old toothbrush and some isopropyl alcohol. And this can just be used to clean solder joints if you have any where the rosin core. So a lot of this solder uses a rosin core, so you don't actually need rosin. I'm sure you guys have seen the rosin pins, but I've never used a rosin pin, and my solder joints look very, very good. So the rosin core solder, you do have some rosin, which is essentially a compound that basically binds the solder to whatever metal you're soldering it to. It helps the adhesion from the solder to the metal that you're soldering it to. And anyways, it leaves a residue behind, and that's why you would want some isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush. If you are conformal coating, you are going to need to clean the crap out of whatever you've just soldered to get all the rosin residue off so that you can conformal coat it onto a clean surface. So those are the materials that you would need for soldering. Again, all of this stuff is in the description below. And now we're going to go over some soldering techniques and just general watching me solder and maybe picking up on some of the cues and things that I do. I hope you guys learned something and enjoy. Alright guys, so we're going to get started here. I have a blank PDB. This is something that we're going to be practicing on. There's no solder on it whatsoever right now. What we're going to be doing is basically prepping it to accept some wires and honestly just putting solder on all of these exposed pads here. So first of all, we're going to want to put our iron up to whatever degree that we think suits this particular job, and in general I just run mine at 850 degrees as a generic standpoint. I know that sounds very hot. It's 850 degrees Fahrenheit. However, I find that to be extremely necessary for the quickness that I do as far as soldering is concerned, just because I don't want to heat these boards up too much, because ultimately if you heat this board up too much, these pads can pull off, and I'm sure some of you guys that are watching this video have experienced this. You get the board really hot and then ultimately you try to connect a wire to it and then you touch it and it falls off and the pad comes with it, and then it renders the board useless. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to apply as much heat as possible to get flow of solder onto the board, but we're not trying to heat up the board so much that it makes this pad become brittle and come off the board itself. So first of all, we have our soldering iron here. We have this kind of smaller tip. It's not necessarily a big tip, but it's not a small tip either. This solder is 0.8 millimeter thickness, so diameter, so you can tell exactly, you know, this isn't the biggest tip in the world, but again, it is something that is going to work, especially at 850 degrees. So what I'm doing is I'm actually putting my soldering tip into the wet sponge and just kind of cleaning it off. You can see it's extremely clean right now. You can even dip it into the iron steel wool and kind of, you know, wipe it off in there and get it super clean. Ultimately, we just want it to be as clean as possible before we start adding fresh solder, so that we, you know, have the cleanest surface before we start soldering. I'm going to wet the tip, which means I'm going to put solder onto the tip of the soldering iron. Try not to breathe the smoke. You can just like kind of breathe out. Kind of hard to do this like talking and not breathing in the smoke. But we're going to wet the tip. We're going to get some solder on there, and then what we're going to do is we're going to find whatever connection we want to fulfill right now. And essentially, let's just do this one because it's got a tiny bit of solder on it. So I'm going to put the iron on there, not like this, because that doesn't get a lot of surface heat, or doesn't get a lot of surface area, which doesn't transfer a lot of heat to the board itself. So we want to put the iron down on kind of flat, and you see if I just touch it, it doesn't really do anything. It kind of sticks
but you know, I'm not letting enough heat be transferred into this pad right here to really let it soak up any of this solder. So you really got to kind of get it hot, but there's also a thing where you need to feed solder. So this solder is kind of getting oxidized because it's been, you know, exposed to the air for a certain amount of time now, you know, not very long, but you're seeing that it's not really accepting this solder. So what we're going to do is we're just going to clean the tip again. We're going to be quick this time. Clean the tip, put it here, start feeding solder. As I'm feeding solder, I'm kind of doing a swirling motion. As you can see, the swirling motion, it's starting to accept. I'm still feeding solder. It's accepting the solder, and you can see it's turning into a nice shiny bubble. So you can see there's still a lot of solder on my tip here, so I'm going to wipe that off. That joint is pretty much primed and ready. You can see all this darkness around here. That's actually a rosin from within the solder itself. It's a rosin cord solder, which is essentially just helping the solder be accepted on this metal here. Now this pad right here, you can see, is a lot bigger, so it's probably going to take a little bit more heat to get this to accept as much solder as we want to get it to look like this. So I'm essentially going to, again, wet the tip, get a lot of solder on there, be quick about it, put it on here, start feeding in solder and start swirling. Again, this temperature is 850 degrees, and I have some 6337 rosin core leaded solder. And what I'm trying to do here is just feed in some solder. I'm going to be pretty generous with these XT60 connections because, you know, it's just a little bit easier to have more on there than less. That accepts the XT60 connection a little better. So in general, that's how we would prep a solder joint to accept something like a wire. So this would be like a power distribution board, so we would put an XT60 wire on that, which we will do here in a second. But again, that's kind of how you're going to do it. Now, real quickly, I just want to show you, this is like rosin that's left over. You can go over with isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush, and you can actually clean that off if you want. So I'll dump some isopropyl alcohol on here. And then, you know, kind of go over this. Probably not enough alcohol on there, but yeah, you can go over this and get it to be really clean. I would recommend doing this if you plan on conformal coating anything. For those of you that don't know what conformal coating is, that's where you essentially have a clean build and then you go over the top of it with like a light silicone film and paint over it so that if water gets on it, it doesn't actually affect the electronics underneath, if you do it correctly, that is. So again, I could clean this a little more if I wanted to, put some more isopropyl on there, get a toothbrush, and again, this is kind of like not necessary. I don't do this on my builds, but if you want it to look really clean, you can totally do this and get a really clean outcome. So one last thing, we'll go ahead and desolder some stuff. So I talked about this wick earlier. How we're going to wick this is, again, every single time you deal with solder, you're going to want to wet the tip. Now that's just going to, it's going to make everything a lot easier. So again, if I were going to wick this off, say I didn't want this solder on here for some reason, and maybe I just put it on there and I don't really want it on there. See how I'm shining these up by just adding more solder to them? Makes them super, super shiny. You can just add fresh solder. If I wanted to wick this off, I would get this hot first. I'd make sure my tip's pretty wet, and then I would introduce the wick and kind of pull the wick through the solder joint, and ultimately it's going to remove all of that solder. And you're left over with a lot of residue, but again, you can clean that off with isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush. And then you're left over with a super clean solder-free pad. Alright, so basically I'm going to be going over putting an XT60 connection onto a PDB. This PDB is not tinned, and then we haven't tinned or cut our XT60 connections yet. So first of all, I'm going to take my solder, and I like to work off of the roll, so I'm going to just cut me a piece off so that I'm not attached to this stupid roll anymore. I'm going to straighten it out. I'm going to just go ahead and tin this PDB. Again, putting as much surface area and giving a little bit of a wiggle. It kind of helps get it to flow quicker. Try not to breathe the smoke. Again, we're kind of hot already in that area, so Just feeding in the new solder. We're putting a pretty good amount on here because this is going to be where our XT60 connection goes, and usually the more the merrier on this connection, at least, or major connections, because it just makes life easier when it's flowed all the way over the top of a connection. So we got a lot of rosin residue there. We got a big solder blob. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to strip the ends of these wires. I'm going to try not to cut any of the wire whatsoever. I'm just going to try to cut the little silicone edge off of it. And ideally you want to use silicone wire because vinyl wire is going to melt when you get it hot. I don't care how good of a solderer you are, vinyl wire always melts and looks bad. So we've cut the ends off of this. Now I'm going to tin these wires. Ideally you would want some kind of alligator clamp or something to hold this, but I think I can make it work like this. I'm going to be feeding solder actually into the iron, kind of in the corner of where the iron and the wire are meeting, and then once the solder starts to flow really heavily, you'll notice I can start feeding it onto the wire itself, and that's a lot on there, so I'm probably gonna just get it hot and kind of sling some extra solder off. Again, I'm going to feed in the corner, kind of where the iron is, get it to start flowing onto the actual wire itself, and then I can start feeding into the wire, and you saw that it just sucked that solder right in there because it got really hot. And what we're trying to do is we're just trying to make sure that the entire wire is covered in solder. There's no excess. Like sometimes you'll get one side soldered completely and then the other side you look and there's excess strands hanging out. You don't want that. So I'm gonna grab me some more solder. And I'm going to wet the tip because we're about to connect these two things. I'm going to wet this tip, get a pretty good amount on there, and then I'm going to turn it in a way that's a little more advantageous. And I got a wet tip. I got both ends tinned very, very thoroughly. So I'm going to heat up the base first. I'm going to heat this guy up, get him pretty liquid, and then I'm going to put this on top and kind of give it a little bit of a wiggle. And that wiggle kind of moves the heat down. I'm going to wiggle the top and then just pull it off like that, and you got a perfect solder joint. Same goes for this. So I'm going to make sure I got the movement in the room that I need. I'm going to wiggle the bottom, place it on top, wiggle. I didn't move fast enough. So I can come in sideways and just kind of get as much surface area as possible. Kind of wiggle it down, get it where I want it, and try to get out as quickly as possible because I started to feel the wire heat up right here. And ideally you just want to get in and out as quickly as possible. You don't want to be holding the iron on there for more than probably 10 to 15 seconds on a big joint like this, because what happens is the solder will start seeping through the wire and it will become really stiff and not as malleable here anymore. And ultimately if you have a very short wire and it becomes super stiff, then it can tend to break and pull pads off. So that's kind of ideally what you want when you're talking about soldering on an XT60 connection to a PDB, and it very much translates to pretty much every wire situation that you're going to be putting on to anything, even including like flight controllers and whatnot. It's just a smaller version. You're a lot faster because you don't have to heat up as much metal. Alright, so just a little bonus thing. I know a lot of you guys are into putting caps on stuff, and this can be kind of a pain in the butt. And generally, what you want to do, again, is you want to tin both sides. So I'm bent these legs. I'm going to tin both sides here. I'm going to get my tip pretty wet. Got a lot of solder going on here. And then we're going to literally just kind of put this guy on, start to flow him, start wiggling, and pull off. Now I'm gonna shift this guy down here. Once you got one side kind of locked down, you can go in here and literally just feed solder onto the top of him. Kind of give it a little bit of a wiggle, put some pressure down. And you're probably going to want to put a little bit of pressure on the actual cap itself.
Get some of that heat transferred through there. I need more surface area to get the heat to transfer through to the bottom solder joint. And then there you go. You can come back on here and kind of run over the top and get this one kind of thick and roasty. So yeah, that's kind of how you add onto a solder joint. If I wanted to like add a wire on there, the same thing. Like I would tin the wire, get my tip pretty wet, come in here and literally just try to get as much of the surface area on as I can, and yeah, here just added a wire on there. So again, like this is a very challenging scenario, and I have the temperature on the iron extremely hot. Again, it's at 850 degrees, and you see how quickly I'm moving, and it's very important that you know that you've got to move quickly, otherwise you're going to melt the wire, you're going to get things too hot. And ultimately, the worst case scenario is if you get this board too hot, these pads will end up pulling off. So if you have an iron and you're just like constantly holding it on there, trying to get things to heat up, so you're not basically you're holding it on there and it's not melting. You know, you can try wiggling it and adding more solder to get it to flow faster, but ultimately you don't want too much heat in this board itself, or these pads become very they can basically pull off very easily, and that's what you don't want. So again, if you're going to run a lot of heat, it's good, but you got to be quick. If you're not going to run a lot of heat, especially on something like this, you want a very hot iron so that you can get in, get everything all melted, and get out quickly. Otherwise, you're going to heat this board up and pull pads off. That's a fatal mistake that a lot of new solderers make. All right, I'm going to show you another technique where I use a pair of needle nose pliers to solder on some motor wires. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually tin these motor wires, tin the ends of them. As you can see, you always want to tin everything. You want to tin both sides of the joint that you're trying to solder. So I'm going to put it on this motor wire right here. I'm going to tin both of these. You can see there's probably a little too much solder on that one, but I want to tin. I can actually grab this and pull it off with the iron itself. I've tinned both sides here. We're pretty nicely tinned. Now this may be slightly difficult because I don't have the most proper angle without getting in the way here of you guys. But ideally what you're gonna do is when this is like stuck on a quad itself, you'd grab these needle nose pliers and you come in here and you literally just heat up this board. And again, it's kind of moving on me, but you can see how that works. You heat it up, wet the tip, push it in there, and you're good to go. Grab the next one. And again, this is going to be harder because it's a little shorter and I don't have anything holding me down. But ideally you want to be flush and in the pocket. And again, I'm just practicing. I like putting things on, making sure these solder joints are going all the way through. And you know, this is all stuff for you guys to practice. Like, you want to make sure these things, your solder joints, look really nice and shiny when you're done. Like, that's the kind of end goal, is to have really nice shiny solder joints, and just in general be confident in your soldering skills, because at the end of the day, that's really what makes your aircraft stay in the air, is making sure all the electrical connections work. And again, I'm not using any rosin or anything. This rosin core solder is working perfectly fine. I'm just touching these things. Once they get kind of hot, you can see it just melts right on there. Not really having too much of a problem. So here is some wire that I just kind of have lying around. I'm going to tin these tips and I'm going to solder them on. This is vinyl wire, so it's not going to be the most ideal stuff, but you'll kind of get the idea of what's going on, and it'll be good practice. So I'm going to take this stuff and I'm literally just going to, that's it. That's how easy it is. You tin the tip, you tin the edge here, you come in, you touch, and you pull away, and you let it solder. Like, the hardest part about this is in and out. You got to get quick about getting on to the getting the solder
to melt and then getting out of there. So I'm taking this, and that's it. So those are on there, those solder joints are on there. If I wanted to take them off, this is the same thing. Super quick. It's easier if you wet the tip. So you get the tip, a little bit of solder on there, not too much, just enough. Touch it, pull it off. Touch it, pull it off. And again, my iron is really hot, so it's making life easy for me as far as being able to be quick. But at the same time, it can be dangerous if you're holding stuff on there for too long. Touch it, it's off. Touch it, it's back on. Touch it, it's off. And the reason it's doing that is because I have some wet solder actually on the tip of the iron. If the iron is not, if it's not wet, it's a little less smooth. But since the iron keeps getting wet, then it keeps going as smoothly as I want it. Hey guys, so just another little tip and trick. Basically every time that you are done soldering for the day, you want to make sure you clean your tip as much as you can. And you're going to be cleaning the tip of the iron pretty much between every single connection that you make. So, you know, when you wet the tip, it means putting solder on the tip itself. You're going to be wetting it and cleaning it, wetting it and cleaning it, making a connection, then cleaning it off because there's rosin inside this solder and it makes everything dirty. So you want a clean surface every single time that you're going in to make a new solder connection. So at the end of the day, when you're done soldering, you're going to want to make sure that you actually wet the tip of the iron itself, and then try not to breathe in any of the smoke. Put it back in there, turn your iron off, and you're good to go. That'll just prolong the life of the tip that you have on there. Ultimately, the tip size, I know there's going to be a lot of people that ask, like, what tip should I get? Well, you want a tip that's not too small and not too big. Too big, and it's not going to be able to fit on small components like something like this where you're working on a flight controller. I mean, it can be done, but it's a little more challenging and can cause problems for beginners. If the tip is too small, then it's not going to be hot enough to do something like this where you want to solder an XT60 connection. So ideally, the tip, generally the standard tip that comes with like this TS100 or even this guy, I think they're a little bit, they're flat on one side, and I would say it's probably 2 millimeters, like a 2 millimeter flathead screwdriver, and then it kind of tapers up. And in all honesty, I've never really had any problems with having to put on a smaller tip. This seems to be a good general size for everything that I would need to do stuff with drones. So again, make sure you wet the tip before every single connection. I know people are going to make fun of that, but it's pretty much a necessity for soldering and making sure your connections are going to be good. And ideally, at the end of the day, how you can tell that your solder joints are good is that they are extremely shiny. They will get dull with time because oxidation and whatnot, but in general, the first time you get done with a solder connection, it should be very, very shiny, almost looks silver, like a polished silver look. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I enjoyed putting it together actually and kind of trying to explain some of my soldering secrets. And if you liked it, please like this video. And if you want to subscribe and see more or have any comments for videos that you want to see, you can put them in the comments below and I'll try my best to make them come to life. Thank you guys. See you in the next one.